Alright, welcome back to another web development video where I show you how to make modern websites using HTML5, CSS3, and a little bit of JavaScript. In this video, I'm going to talk about a new layout, sort of a magazine style layout, and I'll show you this is sort of what we're going to go for here. So a two-column spread with sort of a top section, kind of a minimalist top section here that has a call out in it, and we're going to make that responsive, and let's get into it. So we have just some basic content here. Haven't done a lot here. I have the call out part, and then I have the text columns here. So nothing especially difficult to set up here. So each of these is going to be a grid item, and then they each have sort of a specific class that we're going to use to control the layout. So the first thing that we need to do, let's pull our reference back up. First thing we need to do is I want to create the grid structure. So the way I've divided this up is two columns. So you can see one column, two columns here that go all the way to the top. And then I'm also going to divide it out into two different rows. So I'll make sure that I do that in the CSS. So first we have to declare our grid. So we come down and we say the grid is going to be display grid, and then we're going to say grid template columns, and just do a repeat notation 2 and 1 FR. So that's just going to split it into two columns. You can see now that we only have two items, so each one is going to take up one column. There's only one row so far. I'm not going to add the rows, so I'm going to control that at each individual level instead of doing grid template rows. You could do grid template rows auto if you wanted to. That's the default, so there's no need necessarily if you're going to allow the content to auto flow from one row to another. So let's I'm getting over a little bit of sickness. I was on holiday, and at the very tail end of it, Europe got me. So I'm trying to get over that. What I want to do is create this first row up here. So we need it to be on row 1, and we need it to be in column 2. So that's how we're going to start with that. That's called our callout. And so we're going to say callout is going to be grid row 1, and it's going to be grid column 2. Now we'll come back and we'll make that responsive pretty soon. But you can see now that we've put it over here on the right side that it's flowed all of our content back. Even though this is second in the HTML, it flows it to the first available part of our column because we have a two-column structure. So now we need to deal with that, and we need to push it down to row number 2. So this is called text columns, and that's going to be grid row 2, and so you see it pushes it down to the second row, and then we're going to say grid column 1 to 3. So we're going to make it take up that entire space at the bottom. So it starts at grid line 1, and then it goes to grid line 2, and then stops at grid line 3, which is actually over here. We could also use 1/span all, or we could use span 2. Either one of those are acceptable. You could even name these if you wanted to, and when you name them, then you can call it by that name. So like page left to page right, or whatever you wanted to do. I don't mind working with the numbers. It makes sense to me to have the numbers and to work with those. But if you have a lot of grid lines or specific sections, it might help you to name your grid tracks and your grid lines. So now we have the basic setup that we really need, and we are going to split this section into 2 columns. You can see that we have 2 columns here. I am going to go ahead and say use CSS Columns, and I'm just going to split it like that. So you can see now that we have 2 columns here. All you have to do is use the property columns and then decide how many columns do you want. So you can choose literally however many columns you want. I'm going to go with 2 because that's what our design calls for. And then whenever you use CSS Columns, it's really important, if you want a nice even line here, that you have to go into the first paragraph item, or whatever that item is. If it's a paragraph or it has a specific name like lead or whatever it is, you go into that item, and then I'm going to get the first. So I'm going to use a pseudo selector to say nth child 1. So this is going to select the first p element out of all these p elements. And then what we want to do is just set the margin of the top to 0. And you can see now that it pulls it up and we get this nice straight line here. So remember, all p tags have a little bit of margin on top and a little bit of margin on bottom, and that's what creates the space in between your paragraphs. So we're going to get rid of that space. That looks good, and you can see now that our columns are flowing really well. So let's take a look at this top section here. We need to create some height here. I'm just going to use the height property. You could use a more elastic property, like creating some padding here, however you want to do that. But I'm just going to go ahead and use height on here, and I'm going to say it's a height of let's say like 50 viewport heights. So you can see that that automatically gives us whatever the viewport height is. It's going to take up half of that space here. Before we get too far, I want to also create, you can see that there's a good bit of padding here on the grid, so I'm just going to put that on the grid and say padding of like 2 rem. So it gives us a little bit of more space here around the outside of the grid. Let's style our callout. So for that, we'll say callout p, and what I want to do is first I want to display this as flex. Let's actually put that on the callout, and then we'll say align item center, and that should pull it down to the middle of our section. So remember, this is the whole callout here, right? And then we have this p element that's inside of that, so it's flexing in this big column, or in this big section, and then this is the item that is being flexed. So we're essentially just aligning it to the center, which controls the vertical spacing by default, as long as we don't make this flex column and reverse the axis. So the original flex axis is along the x, so align controls vertical, and justify controls the left and right horizontal. If you don't know very much about Flexbox, it makes things like this super easy, because what happens is this stays right in the middle. You see how it just moves and stays right in the middle. That's not an easy thing to do if you're using absolute positioning or some sort of funky relative positioning. You might have to use a formula, or you might have to try to use JavaScript for that, but we don't have to worry about that anymore with Flexbox. So I actually have a series of videos about Flexbox and showing you how to use it and what sorts of techniques that you can use in order to control your spacing better with Flexbox. Okay, so let's style the P element inside that, and if we look, we have this little border along the left side. It looks like it's in italics, and it's bold and a little bigger. So this is a call out, so we want to make sure that people see it. So we're going to say border left, and you can control border properties. It doesn't have to be a border all the way around. So you can put borders on 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 sides of an element. So we're going to say border left of like 3 pixels, solid and black. And we want to create a little space right here between the border and the text. So we're going to use padding for that. So you say padding to the left. And that's going to be, I don't know, something like 2 rem. That's a little much, maybe 1.5. And so we have this nice padding here. We're going to increase the font size just a little bit, so 1.2 rem. So just so it sticks out a little bit from the normal size of our text. And we're also going to control the line height. So that's going to be the leading in between. And let's say 1.5, 1.7. 1.7 is probably okay, just enough to set it apart from the rest of the text. And we're going to say font weight of 700 and font style of italic. So now we have our call out, and it looks a little bit different than our normal text, but you can see that it's responsive to the size of the window, the viewport. And we have our 2 columns down here. So we're pretty far into what we're trying to get. So let's go down and we'll style this paragraph. So we'll just come down to our P tag. Remember, we're styling our first paragraph tag, but we can style all the paragraphs too if we come under this P tag. So I'm just going to say a line height of 1.7, and I'm going to just sort of leave it at that. I think I don't think that this P needs it doesn't need a lot. You can see that just giving it a little bit of space is really helpful. We could control this in between space a little bit better. If we wanted to. You can see here that it's mostly like 16 pixels. I mean, it's probably 1 rem of space in between. But the difference is they've come down and they have made text align justified. So you could do that as well, like where you get the nice, where the edges of the columns are not ragged like this, but they're nice and straight against one another. And then when that happens, you can see that we probably need a little bit of space there. So then we would say column, I believe it's column gap. And then you could just sort of widen that gap out a little bit. 2 rem is maybe too much, 1.5. So 1.5 will probably do it. So now that you can see we have this nice even edge. There's a little bit of an alignment issue here that we could control by coming up here, and we could say margin to the left of, let's say, 0.5 rem, maybe 1. Okay, 1 gets us mostly all the way. That's probably a little bit much. 0.5 is probably right, actually. To the eye, it looks like it's not even, but I think it is actually even with the left side. So you could further control that if you really were a nerd about the alignment. And then now, you know, this is looking really good here. We have a nice selection here that you can read without having to scroll or anything else. We have our nice call out, and we're looking mostly like we have here. We could control the we could control the color of the font if we wanted to. Or we could make everything maroon, which is sort of that red color that you see. And then let's make it responsive. So I'm not real happy with the way this is going to go once you get down sort of around this area here. Like 600 pixels is okay because you can read everything on the screen. But we're starting to get a little bit tight up here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say there are a couple things we can do. We could cinch up this section here and pull everything up the page by making this height different. Or we can control this size, which will also pull everything up a little bit. So if we say app media and a minimum width of 600 pixels, then we want the P tag to have a font size of 1.2, which is what we've set. Otherwise, we want it to just be one rem. So when we come down, you can see that it changes the size at 600 pixels. So we get just a little bit more space up here. And then what I also want to do is I want to make this one column instead of two. I don't want it to break out until 600 pixels. So if we come down to our columns, then we can say app min width, nope, app media and the minimum width of 600 pixels. We're going to add our columns. And you can see here that because we're under 600 pixels, it makes it into one column. So that's a pretty nice look right there. And then when you get above 600, it breaks out into two columns. So this is a nice sort of look. When I get to about 450, I'm starting to kind of lose it with this call out thing. It would be helpful if I could pull this all the way over, and maybe it would just take up a little bit less space. So let's come to our call out, and instead of putting it into grid column 2 right away from 0 viewport width to, you know, whatever it's going to be, we can come in here and put another media query and say at the minimum width of 450 pixels, then we're going to say grid column 2. Otherwise, we're going to say 1 to 3. And that's not working very well. Span all. Okay, for some reason it wasn't working very well. Oh, let's also change this to maroon as well. So now we have our call out. You can see that it takes up half the page when we get to 450 pixels, but when the page is first opened, then we get this nice call out. We get our one column text. We could even cinch this up a little bit and say When we get to 450 pixels, that's when we control the height to 50. Otherwise, it's 35. And let's go ahead and move this. I think it's having some issues because we have not put it toward the bottom. I think that was it. So you can see that this section gets shored up just a little bit. So it's only 35% of the viewport height instead of 50%, but when it comes out here, you can see this gets pushed down quite a bit. So it takes up 50% of the viewport height. So now we have a nice responsive grid. If you wanted to also put maximum width on this of, let's say, 900 pixels and a margin of auto, then once it got out here, it would be centered on the page and you'd have some nice wide margins, and it sort of controls how wide these begin to get, and you could sort of play around with that. You know, is 800 better? You can do a count of how many characters are here. So most people say you want somewhere between 55 and 70 characters on a line. So you could check the character line length to make sure that it's a comfortable reading experience for people. This doesn't feel like it's too wide for people to get back and forth quickly and to scan it. So it seems, you know, fine to me. But here we have a responsive. We have a responsive section, and you could use this quite literally for anything, whether it's marketing material or just a small blurb, or if you did have more of a true blog or magazine style layout, you could actually incorporate this pretty easily. Hopefully that's not too difficult to follow, and CSS Grid makes these sort of things super easy to do. And the power of Grid is right here, where you can actually manipulate in the CSS at media query, using a media query, you can manipulate where things are inside the grid. How does it flow through the grid, across the grid, above the grid? You can control this with by adding or removing classes based on particular things that the user does. So if you wanted to add some sort of JavaScript interaction where people could choose different settings, sort of a compact or a loose or a tight type of setting, then all you have to do is apply those things to the appropriate sections of the grid, and it'll actually restructure the grid on the fly. And you don't necessarily have to use any sort of logic or programming in order to do that. So super powerful. I love Grid. This font, if you're wondering, is called Aleo. Just found that on Google Fonts. And yeah, if you have any questions, please leave them down in the comment section below. Otherwise, I'm back now from holidays, so hopefully there'll be more videos coming out each week, and I'm going to just sort of begin focusing on creating different styles of layouts and teaching you CSS Grid, and teaching you Flexbox, and teaching you just sort of how to do modern code by using real world examples. So if you like these examples, I'm going to begin to focus on those a little bit more so that you have something complete at the end of it. As always, subscribe if you like my channel. Share it with other people if you have found it to be helpful or interesting, and that always helps with everything whenever you share it with others. And the channel's been growing, so it's been really a big blessing to me, and I hope that I'm able to help you out as well by giving you some new ideas, new techniques to be able to use on your own website. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.